Electric power.
My name is Karin Edberg and I work at Linköping University in Sweden. In this presentation I will talk about an increasingly popular mobility practice, e-biking. The e-bike as a personal transport tool in relation to and as an alternative to other mobility practices. I will, however, take my starting point here. As the usage of cars is so dominating, it permeates the whole society, shapes our infrastructure, industry, economy and the way we live our lives. It's impossible not to take it into account. Sociologist John Urry calls it the system of automobility. Urry claims that this system can be regarded as social structure, very stable and difficult to change over time. Policymakers in many countries are surely keen to alter and decrease personal transport by cars in order to reach sustainability targets. However, in contradiction to Urry, who advocates a complete break with the current system, they generally advocate for moderate changes within the system, such as more environmentally friendly fuels, electrification. Changed practices is another, such as from car driving to cycling, which according to my policy also is expected to lead to better public health and less congestions. One transport solution presented in policy as an environmentally wise alternative is e-biking, a practice that has increased substantially during the last years worldwide, not the least during the current pandemic. An e-bike, for you not familiar to it, is an electrically assisted cycle. There are different types of e-bikes, but here I refer to the type called pedelec, where the cyclist still needs to pedal but have the option to get different levels of assistance by an electric motor up to a speed of 25 km per hour. The e-bike thus still operates even without a motor. I would claim that the differences between an e-bike and a conventional cycle goes beyond only the electrical assistance, and to a large degree makes it into two distinctive practices. To discuss this a bit further and to describe e-biking more, I adopt a theoretical model launched by Shaw, Ponser and Watson, explaining how a practice can be said to consist of three constitutive elements: materials, competences and meanings. These three elements are brought together each time a practice is performed. When relationships between different elements are broken, the practice ceases or transforms. Materials are different objects, technologies, tools and infrastructure, such as roads, vehicles and clothes. Characteristic for e-biking in comparison to conventional cycling is batteries, chargers and computers. Competences includes knowledge and physical ability, but also shared understandings of how to best perform a practice. Distinctive here is, for instance, ability to charge batteries in a correct way to maintain its quality and to ensure that it's charged enough for fares in different lengths and weather conditions. To use clothes adjusted for the weather and succeeding practices, parking at safe places, physical ability to cycle, and so on. As an example, one informant explained that earlier, when commuting by conventional cycle, she dressed in training gear, brought extra clothes, towels, and so on, and showered at work. But after buying an e-bike, she could wear her work clothes, an ordinary jacket, from scratch. Meanings are then cultural conventions, expectations and socially shared understandings, like that the car historically is seen as a status symbol. E-biking was in its infancy understood as a mobility mode for people with disabilities and rather uncool, but are now often associated with urban white-collar commuters and is increasingly common among youngsters. Meanings articulated among my informants include flexibility, independent and individual travel, predictable and comfortable, freedom, but also environmentally friendly. Based on this, e-biking differs from conventional cycling in several respects. The battery, motor, computer and possibility to choose level of assistance to avoid being sweaty or to get more or less exercise, just to mention a few. Other examples include higher demands on parking and locking, as the e-bike is more sensitive for falling down and for harsh weather conditions, and in general is more expensive, which makes it more attractive to steal. Many users are therefore reluctant or even avoid taking the e-bike if they are unsure if they will be able to park in a safe place. The parking procedure also takes longer time, with more stages, when more locks are to be locked and batteries and computers to be removed. Thus, e-biking demands different types of materials and competences and require, in some instances, at least at an initial stage, more money, time and energy than a conventional cycle. When talking about decreasing level of car driving, it's also relevant to mention that my informants argue that they cycle longer distances more often in harsher weather conditions than they would on a conventional cycle, and that the e-bike thus most often replace cars and public transport rather than conventional cycles. An attributed meaning that unites cycling, both conventionally and on an e-bike, and car driving, in comparison to public transport, is that they all are individual and independent mobility modes, where the traveler is able to keep distance to others and decide route and timetable. As Uri argues, the introduction of the car implied something new. It didn't just replace public transport or other vehicles, but gave birth to new travel routines and additional journeys. The main reason being its flexibility, where drivers can go wherever they want, whenever they want it. Flexibility is possible to attribute to cycling as well, as you know. The cyclist doesn't have to adjust to a timetable and can avoid being stuck in traffic jams. It's not as legally regulated as car driving, as the cyclist can have, for instance, a glass of wine or two, as long as they don't break any traffic rules. It's also more common that cyclists, if they dare, go between streets, bike lanes, and even though it's prohibited, pavements. More examples is specific for e-biking of being flexible, but also reliable and predictable, is that the e-biker can adjust the level of assistance to get to the goal at a certain time and to overcome strong winds and uphills, and that it's easy to alternate routes. One informant expressed, for instance, that she's dependent on a reliable mobility mode that can bring her fast and convenient to work in exactly the right minute, in a business outfit without being sweaty, sometimes on a short notice. Using an e-bike can therefore, as in this case, also be a rational choice to be able to get from one place to another as fast as possible without getting hindered by anyone or anything else. Some of this can be referred back to the materiality of the e-bike, but also to competences to manage cycle and accessories and plan before the trip. The two pictures on the upper left corner are from the commuting route of one of my informants. She explains that she optimizes her routinized trips to make them as pleasant as possible, to avoid cars and to have nice surroundings. If the trip takes a bit extra time, it's usually not a problem. And this is another example of flexibility, to alter the route depending on your mode, the weather, or if you are in a hurry or not. But it's also an example of that getting from point A to point B as fast as possible not always is the most important. The ride in itself can be something relaxing and an experience, an example of a comfortable and nice travel, and where the commute turns into leisure, another meaning appointed to e-biking according to my material. This also connects to issues of health. For some non-users, e-biking is considered cheating, as the understanding is that it requires less physical effort than conventional cycling. That is adhered also among e-bikers, but they frame it as an additional way of being flexible. When physical effort is desired, assistance is lowered or switched off, and when the driver wants to reach the goal without being sweaty or tired, assistance is increased. And this is also connected to meanings in a broader sense, as it relates to hygiene and norms of cleanliness, which for many is a hindrance to use conventional cyclists as a commuting tool. Conventional cycling would for many require showering and change of clothes at work, while e-biking offers the possibility not to. And this shows how mobility practices are tightly connected to other societal customs, norms and practices. In policy, e-biking is, as said, framed as an environmentally wise choice. Even if climate not is the main motivation for the mobility choice among my informants, e-biking decreased the number of car trips for them. And the relation between conventional cycling and e-biking in this respect can of course be discussed, as external energy is used and batteries produced. But on the other hand, e-bikes are used for more and longer trips. I've now mentioned some keywords of the ideal personal transport in connection to e-biking. So is then e-biking the ultimate commuting tool? On the downside is when longer travels are needed, for instance if you live in the countryside, or when larger goods need to be transported. Alternative mobility modes, as long as we live within the system of automobility, are thus still required for many. Safety is also a term describing the ideal travel according to previous literature. There are several aspects of this, but one is that e-biking, being a relatively new phenomena, causes some confusion in the streets, as the speed, rather than being higher than with a conventional bicycle, is more even, that is, it goes faster uphill. It implies another traffic rhythm that users of public spaces might not be used to, and this demands infrastructural development to increase safety. However, one could imagine that as soon as road users become used to e-bikes, the steady speed and faster acceleration are more similar to motorized vehicles, so the e-bike could then blend in better in the traffic rhythm. Another term describing the ideal travel is that it should be enclosed, which, for obvious reasons, cycling is not. Being on a cycle, with or without a motor, makes you exposed to the weather and different season. It's something completely different to cycling in daylight than in the dark, in snow, ice, fog, or sun. That part of the cycling is, according to my material, both a blessing and a curse for the cyclists. So, to conclude, to reach this ideal state of personal transport practice explained here before through e-biking, the commuter needs the materials required, which includes the economic means to buy the e-bike. To note here is that even though it's less expensive than car or public transport, it's more expensive than a conventional cycle. In addition, as the e-bike seldom can cover all needs of transport, cars or public transport are often required in one way or the other anyways. Materials required include also infrastructures such as safe parking places at home and work and roads suitable for cycling. Not all people have that, which points at that traveling choices are a question of power, resources and spaces. The commuter also needs to obtain necessary competences, which, as I pointed out, in many instances are more demanding than with a conventional cycle. However, it enables cycling for those being elderly or having physical disabilities. E-biking also includes some competences not necessary for the daily use of a car. I would therefore argue that even though e-biking in many ways is even more flexible and individualized than car driving, and have prerequisites to overcome some perceived drawbacks with conventional cycling, it will not be able to cover all personal mobility requirements without being complemented by alternatives, unless not the whole system and related infrastructure and culture is changed. How we shop, socialize, spend our holidays, distance between work and home, and so on. A question one could ask in these peculiar times is if the current pandemic potentially forms such a tipping point. It has, at least temporarily, implied new ways of working, socializing and shopping. In the same time, car usage has also increased at the expense of public transport. In order to make it a long-lasting shift towards more cycling, the development needs to be formalized and followed up by improved infrastructures and policies. That was all from me. I really look forward to discuss this further with you during the conference.